I don't know if you all have experienced this or not, but we had for several years 2 dogs in our home, and oftentimes we would get them some of the same toys, the same bone. And when we'd give them those bones, they would have the bones in their mouth, look at each other, immediately drop the bones, pass each other as they're heading towards the bone that the other one had. Because for some reason, that one seemed to be better than the one that they already had in their mouth. Well, I got to thinking a little bit about that. And ultimately, what we're talking about was not just necessarily jealousy, but covetousness. Covetousness is a sense of jealousy. It is wanting something or wanting something that belongs to someone else. It is a strong desire to have possession or wealth, or the possession or wealth of someone else. And so sometimes when we think about covetousness, we think about desiring what already belongs to someone else. And that is certainly a large part of it, but it's not the whole picture. It's just that strong desire for wealth, that strong desire for money, for possessions. And it often is something that belongs to someone else. The expression trying to keep up with the Joneses is one that we often think of when you're trying to have what the other family on the same block already has. In Luke chapter 12, our scripture reading in verses 13 through 21, we have a situation where a couple of brothers were there before Jesus, and one of them speaks up and tells Jesus to have his brother split the inheritance. Tell him to give me part of the inheritance. He wanted what his brother had. And Jesus, of course, rebukes him and goes on to give this parable of the rich fool, which is rooted and grounded in teaching against the sin of greed and covetousness. And so, one of the things when I was preparing this lesson that I began to think about is, how do we get to that point? How do we get to the point where that's what we're thinking of, that's what we're desiring, and that's what we are wanting? And I started thinking about teaching kids responsibility and work ethic. And I had this epiphany that maybe others have had it, maybe others have thought of this in times past, but it really just hit me this past week. Just how easy it is to teach our kids to be covetous. Not intentionally. In fact, very much unintentionally. When kids are desiring possessions, desiring wealth, and we try to teach them a lesson, sometimes that lesson goes that, if you work hard and you manage your money well, you can have some of those same things that the other people have. And I got to thinking about that, and the intention of that lesson is a work ethic, to work hard and to be wise with your finances. But underlying and unintentional is a lesson teaching that it's all right to covet. Think about that. You're telling them how it is you can go about having what everyone else has. That's what covetous is, desiring those things. But covetousness denies contentment. It denies contentment. And that lesson, as much as we want to teach a good work ethic and a strong sense of responsibility and wise financial decisions, the conclusion that then they can have something that others have is the wrong conclusion. What our conclusion ought to be, not only in teaching about contentment, but as the inspired writers of the inspired text of King Jesus point out over and over again, what we should be doing is laboring as unto the Lord. And let the Lord take care of everything else. Be content with what we have. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13, you'll remember the parable of the sower. Matthew chapter 13, we have the parable of the sower. And after giving that particular parable, Jesus is going to explain exactly what that parable meant. And as he describes the one who is sowing the seed and how the seed fell on the wayside, now he fell on stony ground and then on thorny ground and then on the good ground. And then he goes on to describe that those grounds represent the hearts of men. And in verse 22, he describes the thorny ground. And how, because of the thorny ground, the deceitfulness of riches choke out the word. The deceitfulness of riches choke out the word. When you go back to Luke chapter 12, what you find is this warning that Jesus gives. And in the Old King James that was being read from by Monty, it said, "Beware of covetousness." Other translations say, "Be on guard." And actually, it's a military term that literally says to set a guard or sentry around oneself. To have someone standing guard, watching out, and making sure that this does not come in and affect you, to protect you from covetousness. That's the point that Jesus is making. Do what you can to guard against covetousness. In fact, it was one of the 10 commandments under the old law, and continually repeated in Old and throughout the New Testament. Ephesians chapter 5. In verse 5. In the book of Ephesians chapter 5 and in verse 5, it says there that you may be sure that everyone who is sexually immoral, impure, or covetous, which is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom. Do you recognize the powerful statement that is being made by Paul? As he writes by inspiration of King Jesus, he's telling you, listen, if you are sexually immoral, impure, or covetous, you're practicing idolatry, and those who do such have no place, no inheritance in the kingdom. Similarly, in Colossians chapter 3 and in verse 5, as Paul writes to the Colossians, he says, "Set your sight or your affections on things above and put away or put off covetousness," which is idolatry. This is a dangerous thing that we find ourselves fighting and struggling with really on a daily basis. And I'm not immune to it. So I wanted to talk about 3 main points when we look at this idea of covetousness, when we look at the temptations that are around us. And one of the first things that I want us to realize about covetousness is the power to enslave. It has a power that so often we fall into its trap. 1 Timothy chapter 6, we'll focus on verse 9, but in 1 Timothy chapter 6, backing up really to verse 6, he talks about how godliness with contentment is great gain. Isn't that what covetousness and realiness? Yeah. Isn't that what covetousness is really all about? Is gain, having something, gaining something. And notice what he says. Godliness with contentment is great gain. But verse 9, he says, those who desire to be rich fall into a temptation and a snare. A snare that the devil has set. A trap. This harmful lusts. He goes on in verse 10 to say that the love of money is the root of all evil. Not money itself, but the love of money. That love of money that causes us to desire to have it, to have more, to be rich of this world. And because of that, some have truly left the faith. They've turned away from God because they've been ensnared. They've fallen into this trap. Remember Matthew chapter 19, beginning in verse 16, with the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus? Matthew 19, beginning in verse 16. The rich young ruler comes to Jesus asking Him what he must do to inherit eternal life. And they go through various parts of the old law which He has done. And Jesus says, this one thing you lack, go and sell all your possessions, give them to the poor, and then come and follow me. Remember the response? He went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. He went away sorrowful. He coveted his possessions. He desired to keep them, to have them, not to lose them. So much so, he would rather have them than really to obtain what he came asking about. Salvation, a place in the Lord's kingdom. That's the power of that allurement. Many probably heard about the recent lottery winning. A winning ticket was sold in the state of Illinois. And the lottery had grown and it kept growing. And we kept, I mean, it had some of us talking about how much. It was over $1 billion. And the temptation that many have to go and to try to have a lot for a little. Because of that desire to be rich, that desire to have wealth, that desire to have an abundance, to have more and more, to have what everyone else has. And there are those who, in doing so, even in buying lottery tickets, neglected their, not only God, but their family and their own needs. And we do that through work. We see all the time and movies and TV shows and illustrations, workbooks about those who want to provide for their family. They want to give their family every good and the best of the best. They want to provide for them an abundance of things. And they'll tell you, it's because I love my family so much, I want to give to them, I want to do for them. And they spend so much time working that the wife or the husband or the child would more than gladly give up all of those possessions and things just to have more time with their father or their mother or their spouse. They would rather have that time with them than the possessions. But we get so caught up in trying to obtain those things. We covet those things. That almighty dollar that so many people are chasing. And that they lose sight of what is really important and what is really valuable. In Proverbs chapter 23, in verse 4, Proverbs 23 in verse 4, it says, "Do not toil to obtain wealth." You ever think about that? Isn't that what a lot of people are, the exact same thing? That's what they're doing. We're not toiling to, just simply have our needs provided for. We are toiling to obtain wealth and abundance, perhaps even power. And what an allurement that is. It sucks us in, and it's like a snare that Paul talked about to Timothy. And Satan is baiting us, trying to get us to focus on those things. But every time Satan is baiting us, make no mistake about it, there is a hook ready to catch us, to draw us in, and to turn us away from God. Secondly, there is an inherent danger in prosperity. Not that prosperity is in and of itself wrong, not that being wealthy is wrong or sinful, not at all. But to deny that there is a danger in prosperity is like spitting in the wind. It's going to come back and just hit you in the face. Proverbs chapter 30 and in verses 8 and 9. Proverbs chapter 30 verses 8 and 9. I love this proverb. He says, "Remove far from me falsehoods and lying, and give me neither poverty nor riches." Notice that. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but feed me with the food that is needful, lest I be full and deny you and say, "Who is the Lord?" Or lest I be poor and steal. The proverb writer is saying, listen, I don't want riches, but I don't want poverty. But give me what is needful, so I don't have to, and I'm not tempted to steal, but I also don't rely upon what I have and deny you and say, "Who is God?" But that is a danger. And so there are a lot of hazards that we've got to be careful of when we talk about riches and chasing after wealth. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 32. Proverbs 1, verse 32, he says there that prosperity of fools will destroy them. Remember the book of Revelation Mark has been going through on Sunday morning in chapter 3 at the very end, the church at Laodicea. In Revelation chapter 3 and in verse 17, remember what the church at Laodicea said? They said that we are rich and have need of nothing. But God said, "Oh no, you are poor. You may have possessions of this world, but you are lacking God." Listen, as we just noted in another proverb, not having money, not having possession, that can do one of two things. It can cause you to depend upon God, or it can cause you to determine never to be poor again. And that's a dangerous thing as well, because again, you're pushing God aside and saying, "I'm going to do everything and anything I can never to be poor again," and God is no longer in the picture. In Luke 16 and verse 13, Jesus himself said, "You cannot serve two masters, for you'll love one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." It cannot happen. You will not be successful. Which brings us to our final point. Money is not the source of happiness. Look around at all the rich and wealthy and those with many possessions who are just simply miserable. And yet here we are sometimes saying, if I only had this, if I only had that, if I could have that much, if I had that much money, I would do so much for the church. That's not what the Lord needs. That's not what the Lord wants. The Lord could do that for Himself. He wants you to use what you have now for Him. And realize that what you have now is a blessing. Going back to our reading in Luke chapter 12, in verse 15, Jesus is pointing out, man's life does not consist of the abundance of the things that he has. That's not what our life is about. Whether we have a lot or whether we have a little, that's not what should identify us. That should not what should define us. It should be the Lord in our life. People with money all around us are miserable when they don't have the Lord, when they don't have God. And we've seen it over and over again. In Luke 12 and verse 19, in that parable, he says that I have laid up for myself for many years. He has all these goods laid up that I can take it easy. I can eat, drink, and be merry. I've got it made. But there was a hole in his soul that he had not filled. Even the Ecclesiastes writer talks about that in Ecclesiastes 2 and in verse 3 when he says, I search my heart to gratify myself. He goes on to talk about everything that he did, everything that he had, what he saw, what he desired, he did not keep from himself. And he says it was all vanity. I believe verse 11. All vanity and grasping for the wind. And even Jesus in Luke 12 pointed out, when you die, whose will it be? Similar to what the Ecclesiastes Solomon wrote. Who's going to have it and what are they going to do with it when you're gone? You've got no control. They'll squander it away, whatever. And that's what Jesus is saying. Who's going to have it when you're gone? Why is this so valuable, so important to you now? Money can distort our view of reality if we're not careful. And so, as Jesus points out, do not lose sight of God. This man in this parable did not factor in God. At least 4 times he says, I will do this. I will do that. And Jesus says, this night, your soul, your life is required of you. The one who lays up treasures for self is not rich towards God. Where are we laying up our treasures? What are we focused on? There's a lot of things we can focus on. There's a lot of things that we can do and try to justify our actions, our thoughts, our words. But make no mistake about it, God must be at the center of it at all times. Because when He's not at the center of it, no doubt it will go wrong. Maybe not in this life, But when God's not in the center of your life and your relationships and your work and your speech and your word and your deed, it will go wrong, even if it means eternity. But if we'll focus upon Him, it will go right. And most importantly, it will go right eternally. He's providing and offering us the best life possible, the best means possible, if we'll simply trust in Him and be content and not covet all the things that the world has to offer. If you've been in that situation and you've denied so many things, or you've lost focus of the truth and your focus has been on the things of this world, turn from it. Turn back to the Lord. If for some reason you've been seeking happiness, you've obtained things that you thought would bring you happiness just to find out that it was extremely short-lived or no happiness at all, God is offering you a joy and a peace and a happiness that this world cannot take away. And it can be yours if you'll humble yourself in obedience to the Lord. Believing Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, repenting of your sins, you can be immersed in water. The blood of Christ will wash away all your past sins, and you'll rise to walk in newness of life, desiring that which is good, righteous, holy, merciful, and just. If we can help you to make your life right with the Lord, please don't delay. Come to the front as together we stand and sing.
Oh, Father, draw